everyone for coming. My name is John Peterson. I'm the National Secretary for Hands Up Venezuela, which is an international solidarity campaign with the Bolivarian Revolution. I'm also the editor of a paper called Socialist Appeal, where we cover a lot of issues about Latin America in addition to the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about Venezuela and the Venezuelan Revolution as we enter yet another important turning point in this process that's been going on for so many years. People have different backgrounds. I know some of you know a lot about Venezuela. Other people might not be so familiar, so I will give a little bit of background into the events that have brought us to where we're at today. Also going to talk a little bit about the current situation in Venezuela and the lead up to the elections, which are coming up very soon. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, a new book on Venezuela called Reformism or Revolution, which talks about Venezuelan revolution from a Marxist perspective. And I'll give you some information on that a little bit later. So this November, obviously, as everybody knows, we've had some important elections. Last Tuesday, we had an important election here in the United States. And on November 23rd, there will be regional and mayoral elections in Venezuela. Now, elections provide us with a snapshot of a country. They're often a turning point in a country. I think a lot of people feel that in relation to the elections we just had here. But in the Venezuelan Revolution, which is in many ways a very peculiar revolutionary process, in that it's been expressed largely through the electoral plane. It's not like many other revolutions we've seen in history, where the old state is overthrown and it's replaced entirely by a new government. In Venezuela, because of the twists and turns that it's taken, that process has been expressed through the old state structures, through the old electoral structures, through parliamentary representative democratic structures, and that, of course, has led to a lot of contradictions. A lot of people have a lot of doubts about whether it even is a revolution or not. A lot of people are overly enthusiastic about what's happened so far, in my opinion. Other people are not appreciative enough about what's been achieved and accomplished. So it's a very contradictory situation. And on November 23rd, we will have yet another point of inflection in this process. So where is the revolution now after 10 years? That's going to be the main theme of my discussion. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions, which I like a lot because I don't know what kind of stuff you guys want to know about, and then you can ask more specific questions. So, like I said, the process has been going on for about 10 years now, roughly, if you count from the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998. However, we have to go back quite a lot further than that, all the way back to 1492, really, if we want to understand the situation. I'm not going to go that far back, but you obviously understand that Latin America and Venezuela have been dominated first by Spanish imperialism and then by the Americans. Latin America is, after all, the backyard of the United States, according to a lot of people in this country, especially since the Monroe Doctrine, which I'm sure people are familiar with, which declared that Latin America was, in effect, the exclusive sphere of influence of the United States of America. Originally, the idea was to keep the Europeans out, but of course, that developed into being a license to exploit the natural resources and the people of this continent for the last couple of hundred years. So Venezuela has always been an exploited country. It's been its natural resources have been taken out, extracted, and used to the benefit of other countries, of richer countries, whereas the people of Venezuela, in this country with such tremendous potential, natural resources, obviously people know it's a very important oil country. It's also got all kinds of other minerals and water, natural gas, all kinds of stuff. But all this wealth has always, for decades, gone to benefit a tiny minority of people in the country or been extracted out of the country. So 1989 is probably the most important a good starting point for us on this question. In 1989, the government of Venezuela accepted a package of loans from the International Monetary Fund. But in order to get that money, which of course they were just going to pocket to benefit themselves, they had to implement a whole number of what they call austerity measures, which means that poor people have to go with even less than they had before. So fuel prices raised, transportation prices doubled, and people basically, it was literally either eat or get on the bus. And people weren't having it. Of course, since the 1970s, 1980s, all these pressures and contradictions had been building up in Venezuelan society. And in 1989, there was a massive explosion, which has come to be called the Caracazo. Caracas being the capital of the country. The Caracazo, how do you translate that? Like the big Caracas strike thing, uprising or whatever. Yeah, the big old Caracas strike. Because what happened was, anybody who's been to Caracas understands that the downtown central area is kind of in a valley, and then it's surrounded by mountains, which are filled with shanty towns, basically, with very poor neighborhoods, very poorly constructed, dangerous homes, little electricity, often no running water. And so these thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people came down from the mountains, and there's basically rioting and looting and all this kind of stuff, because people were just basically saying, we've had enough, we're not going to accept these austerity measures, we're not going to be starved to death in order to enrich a handful of people here and to enrich the World Bank and the IMF. This uprising, or this Caracazo, was put down brutally by the government with the full support of the United States government. They estimate as many as 3,000 people were killed during this. This is, relatively recent history and not very far from here in the United States, but this is actually what happened. So after this sort of social unrest was put down, on the surface at least, that didn't end the contradictions in Venezuelan society, obviously. In 1992 then, an army officer named Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias staged a coup against this government. The coup failed. He was arrested and sent to prison. But because he took responsibility for his actions, because he was seen by the people as trying to get rid of this right-wing government in order to do something for the average Venezuelans, the poor people, he was a hero. He was kind of a Robin Hood type guy. And he had to be, then because of pressure from below, he was pardoned in 1994, came out and started organizing politically, touring the country in order to eventually run for president. And for several decades, Venezuela had been run by two main parties, and they kind of flip-flopped back and forth between these two parties that were very similar on all fundamentals. And people always said, oh, you can't change the two-party system, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in 1998, this upstart, former army officer, former coup maker, former guy that was in prison, ended up completely wiping the floor with these parties and won the elections by the biggest margin, I think, in Venezuelan history. I think he got 55% of the vote or so in those elections. That was in 1998. So when he first came to power, Chavez didn't really have in mind any of the stuff that you hear him talking about now. Now he talks about socialism, now he talks about Marxism, now he talks about nationalizing things, workers' control. He didn't come to power with that in mind. He came to power basically with he wanted to basically improve the quality of life of the people in the country. Basic things like running water, electricity, basic health care, education, these basic things that pretty much everybody in any country in the world would like to have for themselves and for their families. But he ran right into a wall, which was the oligarchy, as it's called in Venezuela, the ruling class, the capitalist class ultimately, that are controlled and in cahoots with international capital, with U.S. imperialism, and they would put all kinds of roadblocks in his way, thank you, so that he couldn't implement these measures. I mean, basic things, and he started to realize very gradually, again, this is a long process, but he's come to realize that the old structures, the old institutions, the old parties, the old way of doing things weren't going to allow him to do even these most basic things. Now, what was the reason that they didn't want, that the oligarchy and the U.S. U.S. Imperialism did not want these basic things like basic land reform,